You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Philadelphia does an absolutely terrible job remembering its own history. And for many of your listeners, I think that's going to come as a real shock because you can't swing a dead cat in Center City without hitting something of historical value or importance. But what I would suggest is we over-remember the era of the American Revolution and we under-remember everything else.
Welcome to episode 411 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. 250 years ago, in May 1775, delegates from 13 British North American colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. Why was Philadelphia chosen as the seat of Congress? What made the city a critical hub for revolutionary ideas, commerce, and culture? And how has Philadelphia's early history shaped the broader narrative of American independence? Paul Cahan, a historian of American political, economic, and urban history, joins us to explore Philadelphia's early American history with details from his book, Philadelphia, A Narrative History, which is the first comprehensive history book about Philadelphia in over 40 years. Now, during our conversation, Paul reveals how Philadelphia's colonial and revolutionary past made it the cultural, intellectual, and political capital of early America. Why Philadelphia's diversity, geography, and economic power made it ideal for convening the Second Continental Congress. And how William Penn's plans for a tolerant, organized, and profitable city collided with the realities of urban growth and revolutionary change. But first, this episode was inspired by you. You've been asking for an episode about the history of the city of Philadelphia for a while, and it took me some time, but I found a great way to cover it for you. So thank you for your curiosity, suggestions, and your questions, because your questions help shape this interview. Now, if you'd like to connect with other listeners, share episode ideas, or dive deeper into discussions like we're having today about Philadelphia, join me in the Ben Franklin's World listener community. It's on Facebook, and it's easy to join. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. Okay, are you ready to explore the early history of Philadelphia? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is a historian with expertise in United States political, economic, and diplomatic history. He has a particular interest in the mid-19th century, from the election of Andrew Jackson to the presidency in 1828 through the end of Reconstruction in 1877. And he has published several books, including Eastern State Penitentiary, A History, and most recently, Philadelphia, A Narrative History. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Paul Cahan.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm a longtime fan of the podcast, so I'm delighted to be a guest today.
Well, thank you very much for listening, Paul. We're happy to have you. So your book, Philadelphia, A Narrative History, offers a comprehensive history of the city of Philadelphia from its Lenape inhabitants to the present day. Paul, what drew you to study Philadelphia and to write a book about this famous American city?
That's a great question. Philadelphia is my 7th book, and almost all of my previous books have dealt with the history of Pennsylvania in some way, whether it's the Bank War or the Homestead Strike or a biography of Simon Cameron, who was Lincoln's first Secretary of War. And having grown up in Montgomery County, which abuts Philadelphia, and having gone to Temple for my PhD, I was steeped in the history of Philadelphia. And as I've been researching those previous books, of course, the default book was Russ Weigley's 1982 Philadelphia 300-Year History, which is a great book, but is dated. There hasn't been a single volume comprehensive history of the city in more than 40 years. That's my lived experience. I mean, my lived experience was not reflected in that book. And so as I was thinking about what I wanted to do for my 7th book, I thought, this is really the moment to go back and rethink the history of Philadelphia in light of the last 4 decades of really impressive scholarship. In addition, Weigley's book, while it's very good, each of the chapters was written by different historians. And so the focus is very uneven chapter to chapter. And there's no overarching theme. Coming out of a public history background, having spent most of my career in museums, I really wanted to inject those insights, the insights of place and the stories that objects tell, into a history of the city, and to develop some themes that were consistent and comprehensive throughout the book. And I think I've done that. I hope that I've done that.
Wow. That's really surprising that your book, Philadelphia Narrative History, is the first history of Philadelphia itself in 40 years. And I guess that's surprising because there are a lot of scholars who write about Philadelphia. They use the city as a case study for whatever they're studying: women, the revolution, Quakers, German migration. There are definitely a lot of different case studies one could study when they study Philadelphia, its people, and its history. And yeah, I guess I'm just really surprised that yours is the first book that's been written about Philadelphia, the city itself, and its history in 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have a real embarrassment of riches in Philadelphia. I mean, we have several top-notch archival collections and research libraries in the city: the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Library Company, various other institutions. We've got several top-notch graduate schools: Temple, Penn, Drexel. And then, of course, we've got several great university presses, all of which have an interest in local and regional history. So as a result, there really is a lot of enthusiasm for the history of the city. But as you mentioned, a lot of those are monographs that are specifically targeted for a very narrow argument, built around a very specific set of evidence. They don't really take the longer, more comprehensive view. And my hope is that one of the things that this book will do, insofar as scholars, is it'll give them an introduction to the city that will be very usable as they then go on and work on the specific projects that they are working on. In many ways, it's the book that I wish I had on my bookshelf when I was writing my previous books about Eastern State Penitentiary, about the Bank War, really to kind of understand what the political, economic, social, and cultural background was during those periods.
Well, we're here to take the long view of the history of Philadelphia. So before we get to William Penn and the founding of the city of Philadelphia in 1681, the Lenape people lived on the lands that Philadelphia would one day occupy. Paul, what do we know about the Lenape people and their lives in the area that we now know as Philadelphia prior to Penn's arrival?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Lenape were semi-nomadic foragers and hunters, and they spent part of the year near the river. They spent part of the year a little bit further west. They covered a really massive territory, a triangular-shaped territory stretching down into what is today modern Delaware, up into New Jersey, and then pretty far west into Pennsylvania. But that's deceptive because they lived in kin-based units that were relatively small, maybe a few dozen, maybe as many as 100, and they were very mobile. They would move into an area, they would spend seasons in different portions of it, and then when the soil was exhausted or the game had left, they would move on to another area. So when the Europeans arrive in the 17th century, there are Lenape all over the place, but they're very, very small groups of them. And the area is really virgin wilderness for many of the Europeans that come to settle in the Delaware Valley.
Something I found really interesting when I read your book, Philadelphia Narrative History, is that the Lenape came to be known as the Delaware. Was this a composite tribe where, say, smaller groups of Lenape came together, they came together with other smaller tribes, and they formed the Delaware? Or are the Delaware people one and the same as Lenape, and Delaware is just a word that, for whatever reason, Europeans ascribed to the Lenape people?
Yeah, so the term Delaware that gives the river and then the valley its name is a bastardization of Baron de la Warre's name. And his agent, Captain Samuel Argall, names the region for him. And over time, when the English take over, this becomes the name that sort of sticks. And then de la Warre becomes Delaware, and the river becomes Delaware River. And of course, because the natives are so closely identified with it, they become Delaware Indians. The name for themselves is the Lenape, which in their language means original man. And like many native groups, they have this conceit that they were the original people. And they have a creation myth that involves water and a turtle and all of these kinds of things. But it really is just a function of the English kind of sailing in and naming something. And I don't know that the Lenape would have, across different bands, would have seen themselves as a people. That really is a construct that the Europeans then put upon them, as is the case with many Native American groups. It kind of becomes a reality that Europeans create that probably would not have made sense to the folks on whom it's being imposed.
You mentioned that the Europeans came on the scene in the 17th century. Was this when the Lenape people first made contact with Europeans in the 17th century, or had they already been trading with Europeans beforehand?
No, so the Lenape interact with Europeans for the first time at the very beginning of the 17th century. The first European to enter the area, we think, is Henry Hudson, who sails up the Delaware River in 1609. He actually ends up unable to go pretty far north up the Delaware, sails back down and leaves. But he does recognize that the region has many attractive qualities, that there are potential beaver pelts, there are forests, there's wood, there's all of these resources that attract Dutch, Swedish, and English, I don't want to say settlers, but certainly folks that are interested in extracting those resources. And so as a result, when the Swedes and the Dutch and then later the English arrive, they encounter a very small number of Lenape. Fortunately, they are not there as settlers. They don't see themselves as settlers in the way that folks in Plymouth Plantation and then later Boston are there to settle. They're not there permanently. They are there to extract resources, take them home, and sell them. And this leads to a fundamentally different relationship between the Europeans and the Native Americans. It's a much less contentious relationship, which is not to say that there aren't moments where things turn violent, things turn exploitive. There absolutely are. But it's much less contentious than what you have either in Virginia or in New England. And so it leads to a very different sort of set of cultural interactions taking place than in those other two regions.
Yeah, the Dutch in particular were famous very early on in their colonization attempts of North America for establishing those seasonal trading ports. They'd go into the Hudson Valley, they'd sail up as far as what is now Albany, which was then Fort Orange or Beversvik, and they would trade for beaver pelts or other natural resources they could get their hands on. And then at the end of the season, those traders would sail on back to the Netherlands and sell their produce. And it wasn't until the 1620s that we start to see the establishment of Beversvik, which was a permanent settlement at now Albany and New Amsterdam, come into play where they were trading on a permanent basis. And as we learn in Philadelphia Narrative History, your book, Paul, the Dutch were conducting a similar seasonal trade in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. But it doesn't seem like these seasonal trading forts were enough for the Dutch to claim this mid-Atlantic region. So would you tell us about the imperial rivalry and the different European claims that were going on within this region?
Sure. So one of the themes of the book is diversity. And of course, we associate religious diversity, religious tolerance with William Penn. But one of the arguments I make in the book is that Penn was building on folks living in at least tacit harmony that had existed in the region for 50 years. There had been Dutch and Swedes and Finns and some English and some Africans living in at least tacit harmony with one another for a half century, in large part because the three colonial powers that were most interested in the Delaware Valley, the Swedes, the Dutch, and the English, were never willing or able to exercise the amount of power in the region that would have allowed them to have an uncontested claim. And so as a result, they kind of had to accept the fact that there were other folks in the region. They had to live with them, which is not to say they enjoyed living with them. They absolutely did not. They absolutely wanted to claim the region for their mother country. But the reality is neither of those three governments was willing to put the economic and military resources into controlling the region that it would have taken to do that. And so as a result, you have very weak attachments on the ground between the inhabitants and their parent countries. When the Dutch conquer New Sweden in 1655, the Swedes that are there don't leave. They simply say, okay, well, I guess we're Dutch now. And then, of course, when the English take over in 1664, you have these Swedes and these Dutch, and they just sort of become English. And so as a result, when William Penn arrives, it's not the Lenape in this empty wilderness. There are a few hundred Europeans already living there. And they sort of become acclimated to English-style government in the foundation of Philadelphia and the colony of Pennsylvania. And it's a really interesting story. And again, I don't want to romanticize that tolerance. Had they the tools, they absolutely would have used them to exert control over the region. They simply didn't have them. So as a result, there was this culture of at least tacit toleration that Penn was able to build on when he arrives.
You raise an interesting point, and my read on this is that it wasn't that England, the Netherlands, Sweden, France, and all these other European powers, it's not that they were unwilling to donate the military and economic might to settle these colonies, is that they didn't have that might to give. We're talking about places with smaller populations, they have militaries, but for example, the English army of the 17th century, that's not the powerful British army of the mid to late 18th century that we see by the time of the American Revolution. In fact, England wasn't even yet Great Britain. So countries like England would grant charters to companies like the Massachusetts Bay Company, like the Virginia Company. And those charters basically said, here, you take on the economic risk of settling these colonies. We, as the crown, will take credit and claim over the land. And in exchange for your set of risks, these companies, the investors in these companies, and the earlier settler populations were supposed to receive better economic and governance rights over the land. But they couldn't expect that the English military was going to come over and bail them out if, say, they got involved in a war with a rival European nation or with indigenous groups.
In part, it's also important to remember that the 30 Years' War is going on while this is happening, which is largely forgotten today, but is really quite devastating in its time in Europe. And that's soaking up a lot of attention and money and military power. Meanwhile, in England, you're having this increasingly contentious relationship between the king and parliament that ultimately leads to civil war. And so that, too, is kind of taking attention away from what's going on in the New World. So as a result, you are relying on these private companies to go and see if they can turn a profit. And some of them are better at that than others. But again, you don't have the government backing that would really make this possible. And so as a result, if you want to go make your fortune collecting beaver pelts, that's a bold move. And no one is coming to save you if things go horribly awry. And there are some challenges that early Swedish settlers face in the region. Population growth is not good, in large part because unlike in New England, where you're sending families who are planning on settling, this is largely men, and they're not planning on staying there. So they're not putting a lot of time and effort into building the sorts of structures that would make it a more commodious environment. They want to spend as much time as possible hunting in order to get as much wealth as possible and take it back home. So, you add all of those things together, and it's amazing that these colonies did as well as they did to a certain extent.
Could we talk about New Sweden? We've spoken with other scholars about New Netherland and its founding between 1609 and 1625. And although New Netherland would eventually grow to encompass this mid-Atlantic region that we're talking about, its first neighbors to the south weren't the English, but the Swedish. So when and where did the Swedes come into this story of colonization?
So that's a really interesting question. And just as a sidebar, one of the themes of the book is that Philadelphia does an absolutely terrible job remembering its own history. And for many of your listeners, I think that's going to come as a real shock because you can't swing a dead cat in Center City without hitting something of historical value or importance. But what I would suggest is we over-remember the era of the American Revolution and we under-remember everything else. It's no surprise when you walk by City Hall, we've got this massive statue of William Penn, but we don't do a really good job remembering the fact that this was a region called New Sweden. Even though the municipal flag of the city of Philadelphia is blue and yellow as a callback to the fact that there were Swedish inhabitants. But we don't really teach that very well. And we don't remember the 19th century. That's that moment in the sun for Philadelphia. And the context here is incredibly important. As a result of the 30 Years' War, Sweden had kind of a moment economically, politically, militarily. And as a result, it gave the country sort of an inflated sense of its identity. And it was like, wow, we're going to get in on these New World colonies because that seems to be what imperial powers do. And so New Sweden existed from 1638 to 1655. And it stretched from what is today Delaware. In fact, one of the forts was in Christiana, Delaware, all the way up into Pennsylvania, along the Delaware River, almost as far north as Easton, and then out into New Jersey. Now, again, there were only a few hundred folks at its height. So you can claim it on the map. And if you look at it on a map, it looks really impressive. But they didn't have that kind of control. They couldn't control that area. And part of that was about being as bold as possible so the Dutch and the English kind of maintain a hands-off posture. Meanwhile, the English are claiming that area and the Dutch are claiming that area. So there are all these kinds of friction between what's going on in New Sweden and what's going on in New Amsterdam and what's going on in Virginia. But there was a moment where Sweden had a legitimate foothold on North America. And they lose it when in 1655, troops from New Amsterdam sweep down and basically conquer New Sweden. And it gets absorbed into New Netherlands. And it gets broken up into 3 areas of New Netherlands. And then 9 years later, the English swing down and take the whole thing. They conquer New Amsterdam and it becomes New York. But it's one of those things. And I'll tell you, there's a fantastic museum of Swedish heritage and history in Philadelphia. It's in FDR Park in South Philadelphia. And most folks, even folks that have lived there their entire lives, have no idea it exists. And they have no idea of this Swedish legacy that plays an incredibly important part in laying the groundwork for the foundation of Pennsylvania under William Penn.
Well, as you noted, we are going to talk about the Revolutionary period in Philadelphia, but so we don't overlook this period of early Pennsylvania history. What was New Sweden like as a colony? You gave us a geographic lay of the land, but who settled in New Sweden and what did people do for work there and what made this colony work as a colony?
What makes it work? That's an interesting question. Hunting and gathering, basically. I mean, they're there for beaver pelts. The Europeans had hunted the beaver to extinction. Beaver pelts are particularly good for hat making because they're nearly waterproof. And so as a result, what makes it go is trading with the Native Americans, the Lenape, for beaver pelts, exchanging wampum, which does not occur naturally in Pennsylvania. And that means that you're drawn into contact with the Dutch because they're the ones that are really in control of the wampum at that point. And so as a result, what makes it go is diplomacy. You're out on the absolute fringes of the known world. It's a few hundred at its height, Europeans, Swedes, and Finns to a certain extent, living in basically 1 or 2 forts, trading with Native Americans, and basically trying to keep yourself alive long enough to get the pelts, load them onto ships, and get back out into the Atlantic. At one point, Johann Prince is sent to the colony basically to make it run because it's not running particularly well. And he runs it with a very dictatorial hand, which as a result makes folks very, very unhappy. But I think his dispatch to the region tells you that it's not, in fact, working, that it's too far away, that all of these other things that are going on in Europe are distracting attention. They're not getting the kind of support that they want. And the folks that are going out to North America are folks with dollar signs in their eyes. They're not necessarily folks who have the skills to create the kinds of settlements and farms that are able to support a population. So it's one of the many poorly thought out colonial adventures in the 17th century. And as a result, a lot of people die, a lot of people get sick, and it's just a function of the fact that the English aren't doing much better and the Dutch aren't doing much better, that they exist as long as they do under Sweden's flag.
Funnily enough, as you were describing New Sweden, I was actually picturing Jamestown in the early days of its settlement in my head. Disease, men doing whatever they wanted, but not necessarily farming to keep the colony alive, bad water, and just all these trials and tribulations.
Sure, absolutely. Even to a certain extent, you look at Plymouth, and even though they have a different model, motivating people to work for the common good is incredibly difficult. And they never quite find the magic formula to do that. I mean, they rely very heavily on the natives early on. And it's just a function of they just keep sending people, and many of them are women, that colony grows kind of naturally. You don't get that in New Sweden until the Quakers arrive.
Well, before we talk about the Quakers, we should talk about the Dutch and then the English conquest of New Sweden. So would you tell us about those conquests?
So the Dutch sweep down in 1655 and absorb New Sweden into New Netherlands. Then in 1664, an English fleet sails into New Amsterdam and basically says, mine. And as a result, New Amsterdam becomes New York, named for Charles II's brother, the Duke of York, who becomes James II. As a result, the English crown has all of this land, but Charles II, much like his father, is perpetually short of cash and has a particularly difficult relationship with Parliament and is always looking for ways to capitalize on that. And so William Penn, whose father had been an admiral during the English Civil War, had endeared himself to Charles II, had lent them money. And Penn comes up with this idea, it's clear you're never going to pay us back. Why don't you give me some land in the New World and we'll call the debt square? And of course, the crown loves this idea. I mean, that sounds great. I'm going to give you something that I don't really control necessarily in lieu of something that has some value. And so as a result, that's where Penn gets control of the area. And of course, Penn does have this idea that it'll be a place of religious tolerance because, of course, the 17th century is a period of incredible religious conflict and open warfare in Great Britain. And this can be a refuge not only for Quakers, but for other discriminated against folks. One of the things that I also emphasize in the book is that this was also supposed to be a money-making venture, that Penn really thought he would redeem his family fortune by running the colony almost as a feudal lord, that folks would be paying quit rents on the land, that he would be taking a piece of their produce. And the entire purpose of the city of Philadelphia was to aggregate all of that produce created by the rich farmland in Pennsylvania, collect it in one location, and then make it possible to send it to Europe for sale, thereby creating the kind of wealth that Penn hoped the colony would provide. And it turns out the soil in Pennsylvania is substantially better than the soil in New England. It's much more fertile. At the same time, the climate, and this is hard to admit, having spent many a summer in Philadelphia, but the climate is actually better than the climate in Virginia. It's not a malarial swamp. So people are uncomfortable, but they're able to survive in Philadelphia. And so as a result, it's really the sweet spot. And you would think looking at that, Penn would make a fortune. But what he quickly finds out is he doesn't have the mechanisms for controlling people that are necessary to collect the tax revenue and the land sale revenue that would make this possible. I mean, people just come and start squatting on land. It really sets in motion a trend that we see throughout the book. One of the problems in the colony of Pennsylvania and in the city of Philadelphia is very weak government. And as a result, you don't have the sort of institutions that made it possible to adequately police the land and really make it pay in the way that it could have. And as a result, Penn ends up in debtor's prison. And then that continues. I mean, one of my favorite facts about the book is in the 18th century, one of the ways that the city raised money was by electing people mayor and then fining them when they refused to serve. Because in my lifetime, people go to prison to be mayor of Philadelphia. In the 18th century, folks are going to prison to avoid being mayor of Philadelphia, which is wild. And that's part and parcel of the fact that the municipal government is never really strong enough to provide the goods and services that folks need. And that's true really up until the New Deal. And it's the infusion of federal money that's part of the New Deal and subsequent Eisenhower and then Johnson and Kennedy administrations that makes that possible. And then neoliberalism in the 80s and the 90s really becomes sort of a return to, quote unquote, what's normal.
Well, I know we would like to talk about the development of Philadelphia, but to touch on this point about governance, it seems that one thing that William Penn had to deal with that other colonial governments didn't necessarily have to deal with is the fact that King Charles II wasn't just granting him land. There were people already on this land, and it wasn't just indigenous folks. It was all these early European settlers who were already settled in this territory. So could you talk about what it was like for William Penn to inherit this area and this very diverse population on March 4, 1681?
So the interesting thing about Penn is he's very progressive in many ways. And one of them is that he absolutely insists in dealing with the Native Americans fairly. And, we can have a debate about whether that's even possible given the power dynamics at play. But he insists on buying the land. He insists on clear legal title. He insists on recognizing their rights and their humanity and all of these things. In addition, you do have these Europeans. And again, because of the change of government, they've changed government several times. If you've been there since the 1630s, you've been Swedish or Finnish, you've been Dutch, now you're English. And the English have been in control of that territory for nearly 20 years by the time Philadelphia is founded. So there are very well-worn grooves for folks to fit into. And in many ways, Penn, because of his commitment to religious toleration, doesn't represent a threat to the existing settlers. He's not demanding that they become Anglicans. He's not demanding that they do X, Y, or Z. And it's a very low bar to sort of get accepted into this new English community that's forming. So as a result, it's a very easy transition. If you were there and you were Swedish or you were Dutch, you wouldn't have noticed much of a difference because, again, the government of the colony of Pennsylvania and the government of the city of Philadelphia governed with a very light touch. It's not enforcing conformity in the way that other places, particularly in New England, are. And so I think that becomes incredibly attractive and, again, builds on that tacit harmony that had existed since the early part of the 17th century.
Paul, Kristen would like to know more about William Penn's plans for the city of Philadelphia. So why don't we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, and then when we get back, why don't we talk about Kristen's question? Paul, Kristen would like to know more about William Penn's plans for the city of Philadelphia. So we know that William Penn laid out a plan for the city of Philadelphia. It kind of looks like a map, but it's also a drawing. And he lays out the city on a grid pattern. Would you tell us more about this plan for Philadelphia and about Penn's plans in general for developing the city and its settlement?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking it. One of the themes of the book is the use of space to inculcate certain values and ideals. And it's very much an elite-driven top-down project. And then, of course, the organic backlash to that. Penn had very, very clear ideas about how people should live and where they should live. And what he very quickly found out was folks didn't really want to do it his way. So there's this famous map that gets created of the grid plan of Philadelphia. It's Thomas Holmes, who is Penn's Surveyor General, grid plan. And it shows, the trees go east and west, the numbers go north and south, everything meets at a right angle. And you would believe that between the rivers, that everything was very well laid out and beautiful and all that stuff. And it just wasn't. Up until the Revolution, west of what is today 7th Street was a forest. It just wasn't developed. And then the British occupy the city and they cut and burn down the forest. So then what you end up with is wasteland. It's really not until the 19th century that Philadelphia goes from river to river. And the reason is because the most valuable real estate in the city is that which is along the Delaware River, because that's where all the shipping is going to be. That's where the piers are going to be built. And then all of the businesses that are connected to that are going to want to be there. So rather than moving east to west, folks are moving north and south. And so, the city drops off at 7th Street, but within a few years, it's stretching up into Northern Liberties and down into Southwark, right against the river. And it's north-south development rather than east-west. And part of that is a function of how Penn is selling land. He knew that land in Philadelphia was going to be incredibly desirable, and so he was giving out plots in the city to people who bought large parcels of land in the colony of Pennsylvania. So if you bought 5,000 acres, you could get a plot of land in the city. And the more acres you bought, the larger your plot was. The reason that we have Northern Liberties, interestingly enough, is because Penn's math was bad. And he actually needed more land than what you saw in that original outline. But what he quickly finds out is, first of all, the natural land, it's not like Minecraft. My kids love Minecraft. It's not like Minecraft. Things are not perfect squares. The land itself has grades and slopes and all of these other things. So you're fighting against that. You're really imposing a vision on that. And then on top of it, once it becomes private property, people can do with it what they want. So rather than these individual homes separated by wide expanses of grass, you have folks building on every square inch of their parcels. And rather than individual family homes, you have them subdividing so they can have taverns and businesses and brothels and all this kind of stuff. And it drives Penn insane. But part of the problem is he was only on site in Philadelphia for about 2 years. So he dies in 1718. He lives for about 37 years after the founding of Pennsylvania, but he's only on site in the city for 2 years. He's delegating a lot of responsibility to other folks, and he keeps getting outmatched by the government of the colony. They keep saying, we want to do it this way. And he really doesn't have the political power to force them to do it the way that he wants them to do it. So as a result, he's constantly making compromises, both in the form of government, but also specifically in the design of the city. And as a result, Philadelphia does become this economic hub that he wanted it to be, but it looks very different from what he had envisioned. And it's just the first of many times where elite urban planners have this vision of what the city is going to look like, and the city grows organically in very different ways. And if I can just riff on that for just a second, Liz, one of the other themes of the book is anti-urbanism. Americans hate cities. Politicians are constantly attacking cities as dens of iniquity, in large part because they tend to be the most diverse places in the United States. They tend to be the places with the highest populations of brown and black people, gay people, etc. And they're always fetishizing rural areas. And that goes back to the founding. Penn hated cities. What he really wanted was a suburb that we're going to call a city. There has been this anti-urbanism at work, and many of these urban planners, and I count Penn among them, have tried to create non-urban cities, which sounds crazy. But when you read the book, you'll see that actually what they want is Montgomery County, but in Philadelphia, and it never works that way.
What about Penn's plans for religious toleration in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia? Was he able to realize his dream of religious toleration for Quakers and others in general?
In general, yes. Pennsylvania is the most religiously tolerant colony during the colonial period. And as a result, it makes it incredibly attractive, not only to Quakers, but also to Catholics and to Anabaptists and to other forms of persecuted minorities. Jews, one of the oldest synagogues in North America, is in Philadelphia because they know that they will be able to worship and they won't be harassed. And it's interesting because at a couple of points, the English government leans on Penn to stop allowing Catholics to worship or to kind of force them underground. And he's very wishy-washy on it, but he doesn't do it. Philadelphia is one of the few places where Catholics will be tolerated, which is crazy because anti-Catholicism is as English as shepherd's pie at this point, right? Like, it is an article of faith. And part of what leads to the upheavals of the 17th century in England is this concern over the crypto-Catholicism of the kings. So when William and Mary come to the throne, they lean on the Penns to knock it off, and Penn doesn't do it. That being said, there is some friction around witchcraft in the lead up to the American Revolution, but even there, you don't get the widespread persecution that you get in a place like Salem. Penn is not interested in drilling windows into people's souls. As long as they are not causing a problem, he doesn't have an issue. And what's interesting is the Quakers very quickly are in a minority in Pennsylvania. They end up controlling the colonial assembly into the 1740s, but they quickly are swamped by other folks. And what allows them to control the colony, retain the control of the colonial government, is the relationships they build with other folks, most notably Germans, who come in droves and settle in places like Lancaster County and what is today York County. And they make a promise. They say, look, we will keep the taxes low if you will support us. And the Germans love that. And what makes it possible for the Quakers to keep the taxes low is they adopt a very conciliatory policy toward the Native Americans. Well, if the Native Americans aren't pissed off at you, you don't have to buy guns, you don't have to build forts, you don't have to have a standing militia, you don't have to do any of that stuff. And it's great. And it works out very well. The problem becomes, as England is enmeshed in these colonial wars, particularly against the French, they increasingly want Pennsylvania to participate. And as a result, there's a lot of pressure on Pennsylvania to change its policies. And that would, of course, mean raising taxes, which is going to alienate the Germans and which is going to lose the Quakers' control of the assembly. One of the leading voices behind that is, of course, Benjamin Franklin, who believes very strongly in colonial defense and is arguing that we should have a tax and we should be participating as English citizens in these colonial wars. Franklin actually pens this incredibly obnoxious anti-German pamphlet about how terrible the Germans are. And what pushes him to do that is the fact that the Germans are the backbones of Quaker support in the assembly. And as long as Quakers control the assembly, they won't vote for taxes. They won't vote for support in the way that the British government wants them to. And it ultimately loses Franklin his seat in the assembly because there is this backlash against his really obnoxious and xenophobic comments about the Germans. So yeah, that all works if the Indians aren't angry at you, if you're not in conflict with them. But the moment that you are in conflict with them, then what you need are forts and weapons and a standing army, and all of that costs money. And of course, if it's going to cost money, you're going to need to raise taxes. And so Quaker political power collapses if you start picking fights with the Native Americans.
I'm glad you brought up Benjamin Franklin, Paul, because on October 6, 1723, a 17-year-old Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia ready to make his mark. And I got the sense when I read your book, Philadelphia Narrative History, that this was something that seemed unique to Philadelphia, because by 1723, Boston had already existed for almost 100 years, so had New York. So it would have been harder for Benjamin Franklin to start a life and business in those cities. But when Franklin arrived in Philadelphia, he's arriving in a city that was still quite young. So would you tell us about Franklin's involvement with the growth and development of Philadelphia and how his rise was possible?
Sure. And I mean, few people are as closely associated with Philadelphia as Benjamin Franklin does. He comes to the city as a young man because there are a lot of opportunities. And the reason there are opportunities is because Philadelphia is exploding. It's growing rapidly. By the time of the American Revolution, it's going to be the most important city in North America. It's going to be second only to London in the British Empire. It's important. And Franklin gets in not quite on the ground floor, but certainly when there's a lot of stories to ascend in that growth. In addition, he has trained as a printer. And because of Pennsylvania's tolerance, because of Pennsylvania's economic importance, because of Pennsylvania's rapid growth, there are a lot of opportunities for newspaper printers in Philadelphia. And so it's really an incredible marriage of man and moment when he gets to the city. Now, for as much as Franklin gets held up as the ultimate bootstrapper, particularly early in his career, he is recommended by men of power and influence. As a result, he builds these relationships that sort of grease the skids for him to become printer to the Colonial Assembly and then later to join the Assembly. In addition, he makes a lot of his wealth extracting labor from various kinds of unfree workers, whether they be enslaved people or indentured servants. So there is a dark side to Franklin's growth. But where I think Franklin is most interesting for the history of Philadelphia is, as he ascends in wealth and influence, he uses that to address one of the persistent problems of the city, which is, even as it's growing, the municipal government is not growing in step and is not providing the goods and services that are necessary to protect even the most basic lives and liberties of the subjects in the city. And so as a result, he becomes sort of like the volunteer, right? He creates these voluntary associations that fill vacuums that exist. And whether that vacuum is a fire department, or it's a subscription library, or it's insurance, he is involved in all of these things. And I think it's a testament not only to what a great guy Ben Franklin is, and we can certainly have that debate, but the degree to which municipal government, which was always weak, is simply incapable of keeping up with the explosive growth of the city in terms of population, in terms of industry, in terms of all of these things. And so as a result, it really falls to folks like Franklin to fill those niches. And he does that. And he's not the only one. He's just the most important. That's a really important part of the story of Philadelphia, is that there is this privatist, by which I mean private organizations, filling a lot of needs that today we would consider the purview of municipal or state government.
Well, we've reached that point in Philadelphia's history that we should talk about the Revolutionary period. In May 1775, 250 years ago, delegates from 13 of Great Britain's North American colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. Paul, what did Philadelphia look like by May 1775? And what did it have to offer the congressional delegates that started to filter into the city to attend the Second Continental Congress?
So Philadelphia offers several things, one of which is geographic location. It's almost smack dab in the middle of the eastern seaboard as far as the 13 colonies are concerned. So it makes a lot of sense from a meeting point perspective. It's also the most important city economically. It's the most important city from a communications perspective, meaning that ships are bringing news in, it's being disseminated, it's being printed. It's the most important city financially. This is where wealth is being generated really in unprecedented ways. And culturally and intellectually, it's probably the most important city. I think anyone listening from Boston is going to argue that, but I'm going to stand by that. So there are a lot of things that it offers. It also offers food and lodging and places to meet and those kinds of things. So these very practical concerns. If you were planning a conference, you couldn't do much better than Philadelphia in North America for that kind of thing. In addition, the revolution is largely, in its early stages, an urban phenomenon, because a lot of what's irritating folks is really irritating urban folks, whether it's the townshend duties or it's the Stamp Act. I mean, if you're living out on the frontier, these things are not directly affecting you, at least not immediately. But if you're in the urban environment, they are. And this is where news from Great Britain is coming through. And then it's making its way out into the hinterlands. I've always been impressed by the degree to which early on the resistance to Great Britain is primarily an urban phenomenon. Philadelphia is a little bit more conservative than places like Boston and New York are. And I think that also is attractive to folks because it allows them to say, look, we're not the radicals. This is the temperate voice of reason. We are trying to be reasonable here. You are the ones who have broken the contract. So I think that there are a lot of things that Philadelphia brings to the table. And I think it's a real masterstroke that they chose it. Of course, I can't think of anywhere else that they would have gone. And maybe that's just as a function of having been a nearly lifelong Pennsylvanian. It's hard for me to imagine this taking place in Charleston or Boston.
Well, in fairness to my hometown of Boston, the Congress couldn't have taken place there because the city was occupied by the British in May 1775. So it probably would have been very awkward and dangerous to host the Continental Congress there.
Right. That would have been awkward.
Now, in your book, Philadelphia Narrative History, you make a point of discussing how Philadelphia was shaped by the national and state governments that were using Philadelphia as a capital, and how Philadelphia also influenced and shaped state and national politics. So would you tell us first how Philadelphia was influenced and shaped by the revolutionary government of the new United States?
On its most basic level, much of the war is prosecuted from Philadelphia. I mean, these guys are living in Philadelphia, making decisions in Philadelphia, responding to people in the street, pushing them in certain ways. Philadelphia is really ground zero for much of the Continental government during this period. And then, of course, after the war, while you're still trying to figure out, okay, what are we? You're dealing with a federal government that's trying to find its identity in Philadelphia. And everything that you're doing is creating a precedent that future generations will follow. At the same time, you're trying to figure out what are state and federal relationships looking like with a state government that's taking place almost shoulder to shoulder with you. And they're undergoing some really profound changes. I mean, Pennsylvania adopts the most radical state constitution in 1776. It is the most democratic constitution of any of the 13 states. And then there's this backlash. There's a great book called The Counter-Revolution in Pennsylvania, and it literally is a counter-revolution. And in 1790, they adopt one of the most conservative state constitutions in the United States. And in some ways, you can see that playing out at the federal level, where you go from the Articles of Confederation to the current federal constitution. And a lot of those debates, I mean, it's not just happening in Philadelphia, but those discussions and those debates are taking place in the city among printers and writers and folks in taverns. And as you're writing the Constitution, you're writing it in the city of Philadelphia, which of course is going to have all kinds of tangible and intangible effects on the final product. So It's interesting to me that all of these things play out. But what's really interesting to me is that once the state government leaves in 1799 and the federal government leaves in 1800, Philadelphia still plays a really outsized cultural and economic and to a certain extent political role because it's the Athens of America. It's Los Angeles and New York wrapped into one. It is the place where the writers and the magazines and the newspapers are all being generated. It's the place where business is happening and connections to Europe are happening. Manhattan doesn't become Manhattan really until the opening of the Erie Canal. Up to that point, Philadelphia is the cultural center of the United States. And even though the government's in Washington, the banks are here in Philadelphia. And what's interesting to me is, for those of you guys that are Hamilton folks, Hamilton really, I think, does a disservice to Philadelphia because he tells the story of Hamilton's economic plan, and Burr gives him a ration of grief about the fact that you sold out New York City. And Hamilton responds, well, we have the banks. New York didn't have the banks. Pennsylvania has the banks. You can go see the Bank of the United States and the second bank of the United States. They're in Philadelphia. So when you have those kinds of institutions playing such an important role in the national life of the United States, of course, that's going to make Philadelphia center stage. And I really feel like that one of the things that we do is we think that once the federal government leaves, the curtain comes down and Philadelphia just kind of disappears. It kind of recedes out of the limelight. But that's not true. That's really a story of the late 19th and the early 20th century. That's the part that's most interesting to me because we don't tell that story at all in Philadelphia.
I'm also curious about the reverse of this question, too. In what ways do you think the Second Continental Congress and the early Confederation Congresses were shaped by Philadelphia? Because those congresses were centered in Philadelphia.
So that's a really good question as well. I mean, obviously, you have these folks who are participating in government and are being swayed by the folks that they're meeting in the street and that they're interacting with. At the same time, those folks are interacting and being shaped by them. And it's no surprise to me that the federal Constitution is written in 1787 and becomes a springboard for the counter-revolutionary movement in Pennsylvania. And the 1790 Constitution looks a lot like the federal Constitution. So much so that it's clearly not an accident. They're taking a lot of ideas from this. And ultimately, that fundamentally alters the structure of Pennsylvania's government, makes it, I want to say, more oligarchic, but it's certainly not democratic. And as a result, creates a lot of circumstances and a lot of friction that continues to build and forces the Commonwealth to rewrite the Constitution in 1837 and 1838. So I do think that there is a dialogue taking place. Pennsylvania's transformation from the most democratic state to the least democratic state in the span of 14 years is quite a transformation. And I think it has a lot to do with the federal Constitution and then the federal government being in the city.
Well, we have just scratched the surface of your book, Philadelphia Narrative History, because it covers the entire history of Philadelphia, all the way into our present day. And we've just covered the first 4 chapters because we're a podcast about early American history, so we covered the early American history parts. So, Paul, before we move into our next segment, 1776 in Context, would you tell us one thing you wish more people understood about Philadelphia and its early history?
With that lead in, this is going to sound awful, but I wish people understood that Philadelphia is more than the Revolution. I'm a historian. I love the Revolution. The Museum of the American Revolution, fantastic museum. I say that as a museum professional. But there's more to Philadelphia's story than that. And I wish that we had an institution or institutions that told that story in a complete way. The Museum of the City of Philadelphia closed in 2018 for want of a few $100,000 in funding. Its collection went to Drexel. Drexel hired very serious folks who are doing a great job digitizing it, trying to make it available, but lacking an institution for that collection, for those objects. It's hard to display them and it's hard to tell that story. And there's so much more to the history of Philadelphia than just the history of the American Revolution, which is a great story, but in many ways is a twice-told tale. There are other stories that we can tell, and there are other bits of history that are worth thinking about and writing about and exploring.
Well, I certainly take your point, Paul, and I think the same could be said of all these cities along the eastern seaboard that were around at the time of the American Revolution. They all have a bigger history than just the Revolution. But all the same, we are going to move into our next segment, 1776 in context. We're now in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So let's just hit that revolutionary part of Philadelphia's history a little harder at this point and ask, in your opinion, Paul, what was Philadelphia's most significant contribution to the American Revolution and its war for independence?
Wow. I mean, there's so many. Many folks don't know that the inspiration for the Boston Tea Party came from Philadelphia. Of course, there are the great things, the federal constitution, Continental Congress, capital of the United States. I mean, all of those things. Gosh, what is the most significant? I guess probably the Declaration of Independence being drafted here, being the center of continental government during most of the War for Independence. Any of those things?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And now that I've asked it of you, I'm thinking about it. And I wonder if all those things you just mentioned are tied up in the fact that Philadelphia was a cultural center of early America. It was really the intellectual center of the American colonies by the mid to late 18th century. So maybe the ideas that are in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution, maybe they aren't as well fleshed out if they're not written and refined in Philadelphia.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. And I think what people don't understand is, this was the leading port. And so all of the ideas that are coming out of Europe that end up feeding into Jefferson and Madison and all those guys are coming through Philadelphia or being transmitted through Philadelphia. But it's the place where you get the first published abolitionist petition in 1688. It's the foundation of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the first abolitionist society in North America. Pennsylvania passes the Gradual Emancipation Act in 1780. It's also that. And those are parts of the story that I don't think we tell very well, which is kind of heartbreaking because it's really a legacy that the city can be proud of.
Well, Paul, you've written 7 books. So what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I am writing a biography of James Buchanan, which most folks know is the only president from Pennsylvania, probably our greatest American president. Wow, I don't get a snicker out of you on that?
Nope. I'm just going to keep my comments to myself.
Just to be clear, as a disclaimer, James Buchanan was not the best American president. To the degree that any one person is responsible for the Civil War, he was that person. And there hasn't been a biography of him in 65 years. And so I thought it would be really interesting to go back and kind of approach him from the perspective of 65 years of history. In addition, the last biography that was written dealt primarily with papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and the Lancaster County Historical Society. But due to digitization and finding aids now being keyword searchable, I've been able to find hundreds of additional papers that were not in those collections, which shine more light on his thinking and his political career. So I'm really looking forward to that biography. And the press thinks it's coming out in 2 years, but I think it's probably coming out more like 4.
Now, if we have more questions about Philadelphia and some of that 19th century history that we never even made it to, where's the best place for us to get in contact with you?
So folks can reach me on my website, www.paulkahan, paulkahan.com. They can email me at paul@paulkahan.com. If they go to the website, I have links on there and they want to buy the book, they can buy it from bookshop.org or a lovely independent bookstore here in Ardmore, Pennsylvania that has signed copies available. They can reach out to me. I'd love to hear from folks. I'd love to hear what they're working on, answer any questions I can, or just chat about the history of the city of Philadelphia.
Well, Paul Kahan, thank you so much for joining us and for taking us through the early American history of Philadelphia.
Liz, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Philadelphia played a starring role in the birth of the United States, not just as the host city for the Revolution's government, but as a driver of revolutionary thought, urban innovation, and democratic experiment. As Paul reminded us, Philadelphia was more than just a backdrop for the Second Continental Congress. It was a city of contradictions, visionary in design, chaotic in practice, and always teetering between idealism and reality. And while we often center Philadelphia's story on the American Revolution, its history runs far deeper. From its indigenous Lenape roots to its colonial layers of Dutch, Swedish, and English settlers, from William Penn's plans for a green country town to its rise as the Athens of America. Philadelphia's past is a story of ambition, reinvention, and resistance. The Revolution is certainly a defining chapter in Philadelphia's history, but it's far from its whole story. There is so much more to the city's past, and so many reasons why Philadelphia remains central to our understanding of the early American experience. Look for more information about Paul, his book, Philadelphia, A Narrative History, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/411. Remember, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Ben Franklin's World is a proud member of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what's one part of Philadelphia's early American history that surprised you most, or that you think we don't talk about enough? I'd love to know what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.